Inspector Graves set down his notebook with the deliberate precision of a man placing a loaded revolver upon a mantelpiece. His face, which had previously suggested nothing so much as a moderately competent filing system, now assumed the expression of someone who has been asked to perform long division whilst standing on his head. "A substitution, my lord?" he ventured, as though the word itself might require careful handling. Peter did not respond immediately, but rather continued his examination of the cup with the absorption of an antiquarian studying an incunabula. He held it to the light, what meager November illumination filtered through Thornfield's heavy velvet curtains, and observed the pattern with that peculiar intensity which had, over the years, made both criminals and Scotland Yard inspectors profoundly uncomfortable. "This cup," Peter began, speaking in the measured tones of a lecturer who has been obliged to repeat himself to a particularly slow student, "is Coalport, circa 1900. A respectable china, certainly, but not remotely comparable to the Crown Derby surrounding it. The pattern is almost identical. Note how skillfully the gold leaf has been applied to simulate the more expensive treatment, but if one observes the glaze beneath the rim, one sees the characteristic warmth of Coalport's formula versus the cool undertone of Derby ware. Someone has taken considerable trouble to ensure this substitution would not immediately declare itself." Chief Constable Wilmot stepped forward, his weathered face registering an approval that suggested he had long ago resigned himself to Lord Peter's peculiar methods. "And what precisely would be the purpose of such a substitution, Whimsy?" he asked. It was, Peter reflected, precisely the right question, asked by a man sufficiently experienced to understand that questions precede answers in any properly conducted investigation. "That," Peter replied, setting the cup down with the care of a man replacing an unexploded bomb, "depends entirely upon what the cup previously contained and what it contains now. Has anyone thought to examine the residue, the smell, the consistency, the color? Milk, one assumes, but whose milk and from what source?" He turned to address Graves directly, his pale blue eyes acquiring that peculiar quality which had made even hardened criminals feel as though their thoughts were being catalogued like exhibits in a museum. "Inspector, I find myself possessed of a curiosity regarding the household arrangements. When Miss Finch brought the warm milk at 1 o'clock, what was her precise route? Did she come through the main hallway, or was there some alternative passage? And more particularly, was she alone, or did she encounter any member of the household upon her way?" Graves consulted his notes with the air of a man searching for the answer to an examination question he had not anticipated. The maid reports she came through the main hallway from the kitchens. The butler was occupied in the dining room at the time, clearing the evening's debris. No one else was abroad, so far as she recalls. "So far as she recalls," Peter repeated, allowing the phrase to hang in the air like cigarette smoke. A curious locution that, it suggests a certain lack of absolute certainty. Young women, in my experience, are either precise in their observations or entirely vague, but rarely maintain this middle ground of approximate recollection, unless there is something they would prefer not to examine too closely. He moved toward the correspondence scattered upon the writing desk, examining the envelopes and sheets with methodical precision. These letters, all written this very evening, I perceive, given the blotting pattern and the fact that the ink remains somewhat tacky. To whom were they addressed? Graves fumbled through his notes once more. "Mostly creditors, my lord. Mrs. Hartwell was evidently engaged in clearing outstanding accounts. There's one to her solicitor regarding a modification to her will, and several others to various charitable institutions, soliciting information regarding their current financial requirements." Peter lifted one of the letters, addressed to a Dr. Clement Ashford, a physician of Harley Street, whom Peter happened to know by reputation as a specialist in certain delicate nervous complaints. "Interesting," he mused. Mrs. Hartwell was apparently in the process of making provisions, settling accounts, redistributing wealth, attending to the spiritual comfort of various institutions. The behavior, one might say, of a woman who anticipated her own imminent demise. Suicide? Graves breathed, as though the word itself were somehow dangerous. "On the contrary," Peter replied, I suspect Mrs. Hartwell believed herself to be in perfect health, and that any preparations she was making were motivated by the simple tyranny of domestic organization rather than any premonition of mortality. However, someone else, someone who had carefully observed her habits and her household arrangements, had made rather different preparations entirely. He turned to address the room at large, though his words seemed directed toward the inspector specifically. "Tell me, what time precisely was the substitution discovered? By which I mean, at what hour did you first receive notification of Mrs. Hartwell's death?" "The police were informed at 2:30, my lord," Graves replied. Mrs. Dennett, the housekeeper, rang through herself after Miss Finch discovered the body. ND raised the alarm. Peter nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that some internal calculation had been completed to his satisfaction. "And Mr. Gerald Hartwell, the son, the gentleman who arrived within the hour, was he in residence last night? Does he maintain rooms here at Thornfield?" "There was," Peter observed with that peculiar attentiveness which had so often proved invaluable in his investigations, a distinct hesitation in Graves' response. "Mr. Gerald maintains the East Wing suite, my lord. He returned from London yesterday afternoon, arriving approximately 5 o'clock. He dined with his mother as stated, then retired to his study. He was still abed when the discovery was made this morning." Peter returned to stand before the body of Mrs. Constance Hartwell, whose permanent expression of disapproval seemed now to contain a certain tragic irony. "Inspector," he said quietly, "I should very much like to speak with this housekeeper's assistant, Miss Dennett. It occurs to me that persons employed for only 6 months would be peculiarly well positioned to observe the household's patterns without themselves forming part of its established order. Moreover, I find myself curious regarding the precise circumstances of her employment, who interviewed her, what references were provided, and most particularly, whether her arrival date coincided with any notable change in Mrs. Hartwell's health or demeanor." Graves moved toward the door with the alacrity of a man grateful to be assigned a concrete task. As he departed, Peter remained standing over the corpse, his expression containing depths of consideration that suggested his thoughts were traversing corridors far deeper than the simple mechanics of poisoning. The game, as they said, was afoot. The morning room had assumed that peculiar quality of spaces in which significant events have occurred, a sort of atmospheric it that seemed to press upon the shoulders of all who entered. Peter settled himself into one of the wing-back chairs with the air of a man preparing to listen to a particularly tedious sermon, crossing his legs with the meticulous care of someone whose tailoring ought not be compromised by casual posture. Bunter, his perpetually faithful companion, had established himself near the doorway with that remarkable ability he possessed of being simultaneously present and entirely unobtrusive, rather like an exceptionally well-trained piece of furniture. It was approximately 10 minutes before Inspector Graves returned, shepherding before him a young woman of perhaps 23 or 24 years, whose appearance suggested a background considerably more refined than one would typically associate with the position of housekeeper's assistant. Her name was Miss Eleanor Dennett, and she possessed the sort of anxious precision in her movements that invariably indicated either genuine distress or the considerable effort of simulating it convincingly. She wore the conventional black dress of her station, though the fabric and cut suggested expenditure beyond what such a position would typically command. Peter observed all of this with that casual attentiveness which formed the foundation of his investigative methodology, noting moreover that her hands trembled not from fear, but from the peculiar tension of muscles held in deliberate control. "Miss Dennett," Peter began, gesturing toward the chair opposite his own, "I understand you have been employed at Thornfield for approximately 6 months. A relatively recent appointment, I gather." The young woman settled herself with careful precision, her eyes fixed upon a point somewhere in the middle distance between Peter and the doorway. "Yes, sir. I was employed through an agency in London, the Domestic Placement Registry on Gow, R Street. Mr. Gerald Hartwell interviewed me himself, though naturally, Mrs. Hartwell was consulted regarding my suitability." "Naturally," Peter agreed, though his tone suggested he found nothing natural about the arrangement whatsoever. "And prior to your engagement at Thornfield, what were your circumstances? You strike me as a woman of some education. Your diction is considerably above what one might expect from someone seeking domestic service." A faint color rose in Miss Dennet's cheeks, and her hands, which had been resting in her lap, clenched with sufficient force to suggest genuine distress. "My father was in reduced circumstances, sir. The family business failed some years ago, and circumstances became difficult. The position at Thornfield was a means of maintaining independence whilst remaining employed in respectable service." Peter nodded as though this explanation satisfied him entirely, though his eyes suggested otherwise. "And your duties have been satisfactory?" "Mrs. Hartwell was a demanding employer, I collect, based upon my observations of her character and the general state of rigidity which seems to pervade this household." "Mrs. Hartwell was exacting, sir, but fair," Miss Dennett replied, each word enunciated with the precision of someone reading from a carefully memorized script. "She preferred the household to be maintained according to her specifications, and she was not tolerant of deviation from established procedures." "Yet you seem to have acquired her trust rather rapidly," Peter observed. 6 months is scarcely sufficient time for a woman of Mrs. Hartwell's temperament to develop genuine confidence in a servant. And yet Mr. Gerald appears to have felt sufficient security in your capabilities to assign you responsibilities that would normally fall to more senior staff." He paused, allowing the weight of observation to settle. "I note that you were the individual responsible for bringing the evening milk to your mistress at 1 o'clock this morning, a task that might ordinarily have fallen to Miss Finch, and yet on this particular occasion you were entrusted with it. How extraordinary!" Miss Dennet's hands had now clenched so tightly that her fingernails were leaving small crescents of indentation in her palms. "Miss Finch was occupied with attending to Mrs. Hartwell's nightgown, sir. There was a small stain that required immediate attention. I offered to bring the milk instead, as I was already in that portion of the house." "How considerate of you," Peter said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he found nothing considerate about it whatsoever. "And the milk itself, where was it prepared?" "In the kitchens, I presume, under the supervision of the cook?" "Yes, sir. Cook prepared it according to Mrs. Hartwell's specifications. Warm milk with a small portion of honey, prepared in the specific saucepan she preferred." "The same saucepan, I assume, in which it had been prepared for the past 30 years. The one, in fact, which Mrs. Hartwell selected herself and which has been employed for no other purpose." Peter rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man possessed of considerable physical discipline, and he moved toward the window overlooking the grounds of Thornfield Manor. The November rain had intensified, creating a grey murk through which the formal gardens were barely visible. "I wonder, Miss Dennett, if you have ever heard the name Richard Dennett. A rather uncommon surname, I should think. One encounters Dennetts in Shropshire, some in Staffordshire, but the name is hardly ubiquitous." The young woman made no response, though her breathing had become perceptibly shallow. Peter turned to face her directly, and his expression had assumed that peculiar quality which suggested he was observing something of considerable interest beneath the surface of ordinary reality. "You see," he continued, "I made certain inquiries this morning, whilst Inspector Graves was occupied with the preliminary formalities. I possess certain contacts at Somerset House who remain disposed to assist an old friend with matters of genealogical interest. Richard Dennett, it appears, was convicted in 1912 of embezzlement from his employer, a gentleman named William Hartwell, who happened to be Mrs. Hartwell's late husband. The case caused considerable scandal at the time, though it was subsequently expunged from public record through the intervention of influential connections. Richard Dennett spent 4 years in prison before his release, and he subsequently vanished from public record entirely." Peter allowed this information to settle in the room like fog settling upon moorland. Now the curious aspect of this matter is that Richard Dennett possessed a daughter, Eleanor, in fact, born in 1901, according to the records I obtained. The child's mother was never identified in any official documentation, but one might speculate regarding the circumstances. Richard Dennett's family, I gather, was rather thoroughly disgraced by his conviction, and his daughter was subsequently raised by distant relatives in Northumberland under the surname of her mother's family. Miss Dennett rose from her chair with a sudden violent movement that overturned it backward upon the carpet. Her face had become quite pale, and her eyes possessed that quality of desperate intensity which suggested she stood upon some precipice of considerable psychological significance. "You understand nothing," she said, her voice containing an edge of hysteria barely maintained beneath composure. "Nothing whatsoever of what he suffered, of what that woman did to him, of the manner in which she destroyed yet an entire family for the sake of protecting her precious reputation." Peter regarded her with an expression of profound sympathy, which was considerably more dangerous than any expression of judgment might have been. "On the contrary, Miss Dennett," he said quietly, "I understand a great deal, and I suspect that before this matter concludes, we shall understand considerably more. But first, I should very much like to know precisely how you managed to substitute the cup." The silence that followed Peter's observation seemed to expand through the morning room like water seeping through cracks in a foundation. Inspector Graves, who had been positioned near the doorway with the uncomfortable bearing of a man watching events unfold according to a logic he could not quite grasp, shifted his weight with evident discomfort. Bunter maintained his posture of absolute neutrality, though a discerning observer might have detected the faintest tightening at the corners of his mouth, the sole indication of his employer's observation having proven precisely as perceptive as anticipated. Miss Eleanor Dennett remained standing, her chest rising and falling with the irregular rhythm of someone struggling to maintain composure beneath overwhelming internal pressure. When she finally spoke, her voice had assumed a quality of brittle clarity, as though each word had been constructed from some material considerably harder than flesh or blood. "I did not poison her," she said flatly. "Whatever you may believe, whatever conclusion you may have drawn from your genealogical investigations and your Cambridge logic, I did not administer the strychnine." Peter settled himself back into his chair with the air of a man preparing to listen to a narrative of considerable complexity. "An interesting declaration," he observed, "particularly in its specificity. You do not say you did not harm Mrs. Hartwell, or that you did not act with malicious intent. You specify, with remarkable precision, that you did not poison her. One might almost conclude that you are distinguishing between various forms of culpability, which suggests to me a mind possessed of considerable subtlety regarding matters of moral accountability." "I did not poison her," Miss Dennett repeated, and this time her voice carried the quality of desperate iteration, as though by sheer force of repetition she might will the statement into absolute truth. "The cup was already prepared. When I came to bring the milk, the cup was sitting on the small table beside her writing desk. I was instructed to simply place the milk there and withdraw. I saw no opportunity to do anything of the sort you suggest." Peter rose from his chair and moved toward the side table where the poisoned cup still sat, awaiting examination by the coroner. He did not touch it directly, but rather gestured toward it with the stem of his pipe. "Describe for me, if you would, the precise moment at which you entered this room. The time, the light, Mrs. Hartwell's position, and most particularly the condition of the furniture and the arrangements upon this table." Miss Dennett's hands had begun to tremble noticeably, and she sank back into the overturned chair which Graves hastened to right and restore to its proper position. "It was just after 1 o'clock, she began, her words coming in measured fragments. The fog outside had become quite thick by that hour. The room was illuminated only by the lamp on the mantelpiece and the reading lamp beside the settee. Mrs. Hartwell was seated exactly where she remains now, though of course she was living at that time. She was writing, and she did not look up as I entered. I approached the table from the left side, the side nearest the window, and I placed the cup upon the surface precisely where she could reach it without interrupting her correspondence. And the cup itself, Peter pressed. Describe its appearance. Did it strike you as unusual in any fashion? The young woman's eyes had begun to acquire that peculiar quality of distortion which sometimes accompanies the onset of hysteria. It appeared to be the correct cup, the one she always used for her evening milk. I had no reason to suspect anything was unusual. The saucer matched, or appeared to match, and the pattern seemed correct. Seemed, Peter repeated, allowing the word to linger. An interesting qualification. Tell me, Miss Dennett, in your 6 months of employment at Thornfield, how many evenings have you observed Mrs. Hartwell taking her milk? How frequently have you actually seen the cup she employed for this purpose? The silence that followed was answer sufficient in itself. Peter moved to the window and gazed out upon the rain-soaked grounds of the manor, his expression assuming that distant quality which suggested his mind was traversing territories far more complex than the immediate physical environment. You see, he said, speaking without turning to face his audience, what troubles me is not the poisoning itself, Miss Dennett, nor is it the substitution of the cup, though that detail possesses considerable significance. What troubles me is the curious absence of genuine opportunity. You entered this room at 1 o'clock. Carrying warm milk in the specific saucepan that Mrs. Hartwell preferred, you placed a cup upon the table, a cup which you believed to be the correct cup, though in fact it was a substitution. You withdrew without further interaction. In that entire transaction, I cannot locate a single moment at which you could have reasonably accomplished the exchange, unless we are to believe that you arrived at Thornfield this morning with poisoned milk in your possession, prepared with the specific intention of effecting a murder whose success would depend upon Mrs. Hartwell's consumption of precisely the correct quantity from precisely the correct cup. Peter turned back to face her directly, and his expression contained a complexity of emotion that suggested simultaneous sympathy and absolute clarity of purpose. Which brings me to the rather uncomfortable conclusion that you did not, in fact, prepare the substitution of the cup. You discovered it already in place. The cup containing the poisoned milk was already sitting upon that table before you ever entered this room. Someone else had positioned it there, someone with considerably more intimate knowledge of Mrs. Hartwell's habits and considerably greater access to her private chambers than a servant employed for merely 6 months could possibly possess. Miss Dennett's face had become the color of old parchment, and her hands had clenched so tightly that her fingernails were drawing blood from her palms. "You're suggesting," she whispered, "that someone else—" "I am suggesting nothing," Peter interrupted quietly. "I am stating, with considerable certainty based upon observable evidence and logical deduction, that the poisoned cup was placed upon that table by someone who possessed not merely access to this room, but the absolute confidence that Mrs. Hartwell would consume its contents without hesitation. Someone, in fact, whom she trusted implicitly, and whose presence in her private chambers at any hour would provoke no suspicion whatsoever." He moved closer to the young woman, and his voice, when he spoke, carried a note of genuine compassion. "The question now becomes not whether you poisoned Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Dennett, but rather whether you were party to someone else's scheme. Whether your position here at Thornfield was, from its inception, designed to provide cover F, or another's far more sinister intentions. And most pressingly, whether you possessed knowledge of those intentions before or after Mrs. Constance Hartwell drew her final, agonized breath. Eleanor Dennett's collapse, when it came, was not theatrical or sudden, but rather the gradual subsidence of a structure whose foundation has been quietly undermined." She sank into the chair beside her, her body assuming that peculiar limpness of individuals whose psychological defenses have been systematically dismantled through the application of inexorable logic. Tears, when they appeared, seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised anyone witnessing their emergence, as though her own eyes had betrayed some confidence she had maintained with considerable effort. Inspector Graves appeared uncertain whether to offer comfort or to maintain his professional distance, settling finally upon an awkward middle ground that satisfied neither imperative. Peter, however, remained standing with that characteristic detachment which had so often been mistaken for coldness, but which was, in fact, a species of compassionate clarity, the ability to observe human suffering without allowing sentiment to cloud the pursuit of truth. "I will require a full accounting," Peter said, his tone containing neither threat nor enticement, but simply the weight of inevitability. "Not for the purposes of prosecution, Miss Dennett, though I acknowledge the legal implications of whatever knowledge you may possess. Rather, because the solution to Mrs. Hartwell's death lies buried in the precise circumstances of your employment and the motivations which brought you to this house in the first place. And because, he added, with a note of something approaching gentleness, I suspect that you yourself are considerably more victim than perpetrator in this affair. The young woman drew a shuddering breath, and when E spoke, her voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "My father," she began, and then fell silent, as though the mere utterance of that relationship required gathering of strength. "My father spent 4 years in prison for crimes he did not commit. The embezzlement, the supposed theft from Mr. William Hartwell's accounts, all of it was falsified. He was made the scapegoat for someone else's dishonesty, and when he refused to name that individual despite considerable pressure to do so, he was abandoned by everyone." Peter moved toward the window once more, adopting that posture of apparent inattention which often preceded his most incisive observations. "Who was the actual perpetrator of the embezzlement, Miss Dennett? Who possessed sufficient position within Mr. Hartwell's business to accomplish such a theft and sufficient influence to ensure that blame fell upon your father instead?" Eleanor's hands trembled as she reached for a handkerchief, and she pressed it to her eyes with the desperation of someone attempting to contain an internal hemorrhage. "It was Gerald," she said. "Mr. Gerald Hartwell, the son. He was engaged in the accounts, you see, and he had been gambling quite heavily. His father refused to provide him with additional funds, so he began to embezzle from the business itself. When the discrepancies were discovered, he panicked. He had observed my father working closely with Mr. Hartwell, had noted his trust, and he convinced his father that the theft must have been accomplished by someone within his direct employment. He provided falsified documentation, altered ledgers, and my father was arrested before he could adequately defend himself." "And Mrs. Hartwell?" Peter asked, though his tone suggested he already possessed a rather precise understanding of the answer. Surely she possessed knowledge of her son's culpability. She knew, Eleanor Confi, Ahmed, and her voice had hardened into something resembling bitterness. She knew perfectly well what her son had done. But she protected him. She ensured that the matter was settled quietly, that my father's conviction would be kept from becoming public scandal, and in exchange she controlled him utterly for the remainder of her life. She held that crime over his head like a sword, and he lived in constant terror that she might reveal the truth. Peter turned back to face her, and his expression had assumed a penetration that suggested he was observing not merely the girl before him, but the entire architecture of emotional manipulation that had been constructed over the course of decades. "Mr. Gerald Hartwell," Peter said slowly, "has been living in a state of psychological imprisonment his entire adult life. His mother possessed absolute leverage over him, and she employed it with the consistency of a woman who understood that control of another human being required constant vigilance and perpetual application of force. Is this an accurate assessment?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak, and Peter continued with that relentless precision which was his characteristic approach to the unraveling of human complexity. "And how, precisely, did you come to be employed at Thornfield?" "I suspect it was not through any ordinary domestic agency, despite the convenient fiction regarding the Gower Street registry." The young woman's face had become the color of ash, and her hands had begun to shake with a violence that suggested she was on the precipice of complete physical collapse. "Mr. Gerald contacted me," she said, her words tumbling out with the urgency of confession forced through a narrowing aperture. "He had discovered who I was, had made inquiries, had learned of my reduced circumstances. He approached me approximately 8 months ago with a proposal. He said that his MOT, her, had become impossible, that she was poisoning his life through constant manipulation and the perpetual threat of exposure. He said that if she were to die, her will would provide him with sufficient independence to finally escape her control. He asked me if I would be willing to come to Thornfield in the capacity of housekeeper's assistant, to observe his mother's habits, to note her vulnerabilities, and most importantly, to provide him with an opportunity to accomplish what he could not accomplish himself." Peter's expression, as he listened to this confession, had assumed that peculiar quality of absolute non-judgment, which was possibly the most terrifying expression he possessed. "And did you agree to his proposal?" Eleanor's response was barely audible. "I agreed to observe. I agreed to come to Thornfield, but I did not agree to murder. When Mr. Gerald approached me 3 weeks ago, when he began to speak of actually poisoning her, I refused. I told him that I could not be party to such a thing, that whatever my father had suffered, the answer could not be the destruction of another human being." "Yet you remained at Thornfield," Peter observed. "You did not resign your position, did not remove yourself from the situation, did not warn Mrs. Hartwell of her son's intentions." Eleanor's silence was answer sufficient. Peter moved toward the door and gestured to Inspector Graves. "Inspector, I believe you will find it necessary to place Miss Dennett under protective custody. Not as a suspect precisely, but rather as a witness whose safety may be considerably compromised by events that are about to unfold. As for Mr. Gerald Hartwell, I believe I shall require a private interview with that gentleman. It occurs to me that we have not yet heard his version of events, and I suspect it will prove to be a narrative of considerable interest. Mr. Gerald Hartwell Mainter. Ened the study that had belonged to his father with the precision of a man who believed that the careful arrangement of objects might somehow impose order upon the chaos of internal experience. The room was situated in the east wing of Thornfield Manor, accessible through a corridor lined with portraits of Hartwell ancestors whose expressions suggested a collective resignation to the inevitability of family obligation. The study itself was predominantly furnished in dark mahogany, with walls lined by volumes that appeared to have been selected more for the uniformity of their binding than for any genuine engagement with their contents. Gerald himself was positioned behind the massive desk when Peter entered, and his appearance suggested a man who had spent the night engaged in the peculiar labor of maintaining composure whilst experiencing the simultaneous dissolution of his internal world. He was perhaps 40 years of age, with the sort of refined features that suggested generations of careful breeding, yet those features had assumed a quality of transparency that indicated the psychological foundations supporting them had begun to crack with audible precision. Inspector Graves remained stationed near the doorway, his expression suggesting profound confusion regarding the precise direction the investigation was now taking. Bunter, as was his custom, had established himself at a position from which he might observe all parties whilst remaining entirely peripheral to the proceedings themselves. Peter settled into the leather wingback chair positioned before the desk with the air of a man preparing to engage in civilized conversation rather than to conduct an interrogation, which was perhaps the most psychologically effective interrogation technique he possessed. "Mr. Hartwell," Peter began, his tone carrying that peculiar combination of courtesy and absolute authority, which characterized his approach to such encounters, "I find myself in possession of a curious puzzle regarding the events of this morning. A puzzle, I might add, that requires your assistance in resolution. You see, the straightforward interpretation of Mrs. Hartwell's death, the obvious conclusion that she was poisoned through the medium of her evening milk by someone with access to her person, presents certain logical difficulties that I am unable to reconcile with the observable facts." Gerald's hands, which had been positioned upon the desktop with careful precision, began to tremble with increasing violence. "I don't know what you're suggesting," he said, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "My mother was a woman of considerable rigidity, certainly, but she did not deserve to die in such a manner." "Deserve," Peter repeated, allowing the word to linger with considerable weight. "An interesting moral category to introduce, Mr. Hartwell. Most innocent individuals, when confronted with accusations regarding their involvement in murder, begin with denials regarding their actions rather than philosophical declarations regarding their mother's moral status. Your immediate recourse to questions of desert suggests to me a mind considerably more preoccupied with matters of justice than with matters of innocence." Peter rose from his chair and moved toward the bookshelves lining the wall, examining the volumes with the absorption of a man engaged in genuine scholarly inquiry, though his actual attention remained entirely focused upon his subject. "Tell me, what was your mother's precise condition during the weeks preceding her death? I collect from the household staff that she had been experiencing certain difficulties, Declining health, they suggested, though they remained remarkably vague regarding the specific nature of her complaints. Gerald's face had begun to acquire a peculiar pallor that suggested imminent physical illness. She was experiencing headaches, he said finally. Quite severe headaches, accompanied by occasional digestive disturbances. She consulted with Dr. Ashford, who prescribed certain remedies, though they seemed to provide only limited relief. How convenient, Peter observed, that a distinguished physician specializing in nervous complaints should have been attending to your mother's condition. A physician, moreover, to whom she was writing letters at 1 o'clock this very morning, inquiring regarding the financial requirements of his practice. One might almost conclude that Dr. Ashford's medical recommendations were considerably less important to Mrs. Hartwell than his financial circumstances. Peter turned back to face Gerald directly, and his expression had assumed that quality of penetrating clarity which suggested he was observing not merely the surface of events, but the intricate psychological mechanisms underlying them. You see, Mr. Hartwell, what I have been unable to understand is precisely how strychnine, a substance whose bitter taste is remarkably difficult to mask, found its way into a cup of warm milk without the individual consuming it recognizing that something was fundamentally wrong. Strychnine, when ingested, produces a characteristic metallic bitterness that would be immediately apparent to anyone with even a moderately functional palate. And yet Mrs. Hartwell, according to the evidence we have gathered, consumed the entire contents of the cup without apparent complaint. Gerald's breathing had become noticeably irregular, and small beads of perspiration had begun to form upon his forehead, despite the relative coolness of the study. I had nothing to do with poisoning my mother, he said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this particular statement was absolute. Ely, truthful. On that point, I assure you entirely, I am telling you the simple truth. I am quite aware that you did not personally administer the poison, Peter replied, resuming his seat with the air of a man preparing to deliver a lengthy dissertation. That detail, I suspect, would have required considerably more courage than you possess, Mr. Hartwell. However, your lack of direct involvement in the actual poisoning does not preclude your involvement in the arrangement of circumstances that made the poisoning possible. Tell me, when did you first realize that your mother's milk was being adulterated with arsenic rather than strychnine? When did you first understand that someone, presumably someone with medical knowledge and access to your mother's household, had been introducing poison into her system on a graduated basis for a period of several weeks? The study had become absolutely silent, save for the sound of Gerald's increasingly labored breathing and the distant percussion of rain against the window panes. Peter watched as the man's face cycled through expressions of denial, terror, and finally a kind of exhausted resignation. The headaches were not natural, Gerald said finally, his voice emerging from somewhere deep within his own internal dissolution. She began complaining of them approximately 6 weeks ago. Dr. Ashford prescribed certain medications, and at first they seemed to help. But then she began experiencing additional symptoms, nausea, tremors, peculiar sensitivities to light. I became concerned and urged her to consult with a different physician, but she refused. She said that Ashford was an old friend and that she trusted his judgment implicitly. Peter leaned back in his chair, his expression assuming that quality of absolute comprehension which suggested all the scattered pieces of the puzzle had suddenly aligned themselves into coherent pattern. Your mother was being poisoned gradually, he said with quiet certainty, by Dr. Clement Ashford himself, a man who had been medically ruined by her late husband's testimony regarding certain ethical violations in his practice, a man whose career was destroyed because your father chose to believe your mother's accusations rather than Ashford's protestations of innocence, a man who has spent decades nursing his grievance, waiting for his opportunity for revenge. And somehow, Mr. Hartwell, I suspect that you became aware of this situation and made the peculiar decision not merely to remain silent, but to facilitate its continuation. The confession, when it came, emerged not as a sudden capitulation, but rather as the slow opening of a floodgate that had been desperately reinforced against the pressure of accumulated guilt and psychological torment. Gerald's face had assumed the appearance of a man observing his own destruction from some exterior vantage point, as though his conscious mind had finally surrendered its exhausting battle against the inexorable logic of his own culpability. "Ashford came to me," he said, his words emerging in fragments that seemed to require enormous effort to articulate. "Approximately 3 months ago, he appeared at my London residence. He had discovered my address through the medical register and through certain inquiries made in circles where my mother's name carried weight. He told me everything: how my father had deliberately falsified certain records regarding his practice, how my mother had corroborated the lies, how his life had been systematically destroyed by their combined testimony. He showed me documentation, letters, evidence of his own vindication in subsequent years through consultations and academic recognition that his methods had been revolutionary rather than unethical." Peter observed the man with the particular attention of someone listening not merely to words, but to the psychological architecture underlying them. "And what precisely did Dr. Ashford propose to you, Mr. Hartwell? I suspect his initial conversation was not merely the recitation of historical grievance, but rather the presentation of a specific proposition." Gerald's hands had begun to shake with such violence that he clasped them together as though they might otherwise betray secrets his mouth had not yet articulated. "He said that my mother had destroyed his life, that she had done so deliberately and with full knowledge of her own dishonesty. He said that she had done this not merely to protect my father, but to consolidate power within the household, to ensure that she possessed leverage over my father that would allow her to control him entirely. He said that the only justice possible would be her death, and that he did not require my assistance in accomplishing it. He merely required my permission, my tacit agreement that when the moment arrived, I would not raise obstacles. And you granted that permission," Peter stated, though his tone suggested this was observation rather than accusation. "You knew what he intended, you understood that he was planning to poison your mother, and you chose not merely to remain silent, but to actively facilitate the circumstances that would allow such poisoning to occur. You encouraged Miss Dennett's employment, I suspect, not because you harbored any genuine affection for your father's injustice, but because you required a second witness to events, someone who could provide corroboration for your own protestations of innocence once the poisoning had been accomplished." "I didn't know," Gerald whispered, but his voice carried no conviction whatsoever. "I didn't know that he would actually do it. I thought he was simply expressing resentment, that it was the cathartic articulation of decades-old rage. I believed he would eventually abandon his intentions, that the mere fact of having spoken his grievance aloud would provide him with sufficient psychological relief to abandon thoughts of violence." Peter rose from his chair and moved toward the desk, regarding Gerald with an expression that contained neither sympathy nor judgment, but rather a kind of exhausted clarity. "When did you understand that he was actually poisoning her, Mr. Hartwell? At what precise moment did you realize that the medical consultation he had positioned himself to provide was not merely the continuation of his role as her physician, but rather the delivery of a slow death administered in microscopic doses?" Gerald's face had become the color of ancient parchment, and his entire body had begun to shake with a violence that suggested imminent physical collapse. 3 weeks ago, he said. 3 weeks before her death, I found among his papers a detailed accounting of the doses he had administered, the specific quantities of arsenic incorporated into the various medications he had prescribed. He showed them to me deliberately, Mr. Whimsy. He wanted me to know. He wanted me to be absolutely aware of what was occurring and to understand that I possessed the power to stop it, but chose not to exercise that power. "And why did you not exercise that power?" Peter asked, though his tone suggested he already understood the answer with considerable precision. "Why did you not warn your mother? Did not dismiss Dr. Ashford from the household? Did not alert the authorities to his intentions?" The silence that followed was profound and absolute, containing within its depths the entire landscape of Gerald Hartwell's moral culpability. When he finally spoke, his voice had assumed a quality of terrible honesty that suggested a man who had finally abandoned all pretense of self-deception. "Because I wanted her dead," he said. "Because for 40 years I have lived in slavery to her manipulations, her threats, her absolute control over my existence. Because I knew that if she died, I would finally be free from her tyranny, free from the constant fear that she would expose the truth about my role in my father's ruin, free to construct some approximation of a life that was actually my own. Dr. Ashford offered me a gift, Mr. Wimsey, and I was too much a coward to refuse it. I told myself that I was merely remaining silent, that I bore no responsibility for his actions. But silence in the face of murder is itself a form of participation. Inaction in the face of injustice is itself a form of choice. Peter moved toward the window and gazed out upon the rain-soaked grounds of Thornfield Manor, his expression assuming that quality of profound contemplation which suggested his mind was traversing territories far deeper than the mere mechanics of criminal conspiracy. "Inspector Graves," he said without turning, "I believe you will find it necessary to place Mr. Hartwell under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder. He did not wield the poison, certainly, but he provided the essential element that made the crime possible, the removal of any impediment to Dr. Ashford's designs. The question now becomes locating Dr. Clement Ashford himself. I suspect you will find him to be either engaged in the process of fleeing the country or already several hours distant from Thornfield. Telegraph the ports immediately, Inspector. We must ensure that he does not escape the consequences of his carefully constructed vengeance." The telegram arrived at Thornfield Manor approximately 4 hours after Peter had dispatched Inspector Graves to alert the port authorities, its arrival coinciding with the departure of the rain and the emergence of a pallid November sun that illuminated the grounds with the quality of a sick-room lamp. The message, when decoded, conveyed information that suggested the investigation had taken a trajectory considerably more complex than the simple apprehension of a fugitive criminal. Dr. Clement Ashford had not fled to the ports, nor had he attempted to abandon the country through any of the conventional avenues available to a man of moderate means and professional standing. Rather, he had achieved something considerably more theatrical. He had died, quite deliberately and with apparent premeditation, in his consulting rooms on Harley Street, having administered to himself an injection of precisely the same arsenic compound that he had been gradually introducing into Mrs. Hartwell's system over the preceding weeks. The note he left, according to the telegram's terse summary, expressed no remorse whatsoever regarding Mrs. Hartwell's death, but rather seemed to suggest that the entire affair had been orchestrated as a grand final statement regarding the mechanisms of justice and revenge. Peter received this information whilst seated in the library of Thornfield Manor, having commandeered that space for the purposes of organizing his thoughts and reviewing the various documentary evidence that the investigation had produced. Bunter had positioned himself nearby with a pot of exceptionally strong tea, understanding through years of established routine that his employer's characteristic response to complex denouements involved the consumption of large quantities of caffeine and the temporary abandonment of speech in favor of profound contemplation. Inspector Graves entered with the diffident air of a man bringing news that contradicted his expectations, and Peter gestured toward one of the leather chairs positioned before the fireplace. "Dr. Ashford has arranged matters quite efficiently," Peter observed without preamble, suggesting that the telegram's contents had already been communicated to him through some channel that did not require verbal articulation. The man possessed considerable intelligence, certainly. His medical expertise was genuine, his understanding of poisons was sophisticated, and his psychological manipulation of the Hartwell family demonstrates a penetrating comprehension of human weakness. And yet in the end, he chose suicide over flight, which suggests to me that his motivations were considerably more complex than simple revenge. Graves settled himself into the offered chair with the careful precision of a man accustomed to receiving instruction from superiors. The coroner's examination indicates that Dr. Ashford had been suffering from a rather advanced form of malignancy, he ventured. Terminal, according to the medical assessment. He had perhaps 3 months remaining, no more. "Ah," Peter said, and there was something in his tone that suggested this particular revelation had precisely explained an inconsistency that had been troubling him. The man was not merely seeking revenge then. He was arranging his final narrative. He was composing, if you will, a final statement regarding the mechanisms of justice in a universe that had treated him with considerable brutality. He was dying, Inspector, and he chose to spend his final months ensuring that Mrs. Hartwell would not survive him. He arranged matters such that her death would be simultaneous with his own, that they would descend together into whatever afterlife awaited them, bound by the exquisite symmetry of his revenge. Peter rose from his chair and moved toward the library's windows, gazing out upon the grounds of Thornfield Manor, where servants were engaged in the business of maintaining the house, despite the considerable disruption that murder and its subsequent investigation had caused. What strikes me as particularly tragic, he continued, is that Dr. Ashford's analysis of Mrs. Hartwell's culpability was not entirely accurate. Certainly she bore responsibility for the false testimony regarding his medical practice, but she did not act alone. She acted at the behest of her husband, and she bore only the female responsibility for protecting her family that characterized her entire existence. She was complicit in injustice, absolutely, but complicity is not the same as conspiracy. And yet Dr. Ashford's vendetta was directed toward her with singular intensity, perhaps because she was more immediately available to his revenge than her deceased husband could possibly be. "The question now becomes," Peter said, turning back to face Graves, "what shall we do regarding Mr. Gerald Hartwell and Miss Eleanor Dennett? Both are implicated in the events surrounding Mrs. Hartwell's death, though the precise nature of their culpability differs considerably. Gerald Hartwell knew that poisoning was occurring and chose not to prevent it, which constitutes a form of complicity, but perhaps not the degree of complicity that would justify prosecution for conspiracy to commit murder. Eleanor Dennett came to Thornfield under circumstances that were certainly ethically compromised, but she actively refused to participate in the poisoning itself when the moment of commitment arrived. She chose conscience over complicity, which is more than one can say for Gerald Hartwell." Graves shifted in his chair, his expression suggesting he was grappling with the moral complexities of the situation. "The Crown Prosecutor will insist upon charges," he said finally. "The public scandal is considerable, and there will be pressure to demonstrate that justice is being served through prosecutorial action." Undoubtedly, Peter agreed. However, I would suggest that the most appropriate charges might be considerably more modest than full conspiracy to commit murder. Accessory after the fact, perhaps, or misprision of felony. Charges sufficient to acknowledge culpability without imposing the ultimate severity that would attach to direct participation in the actual poisoning. As for Miss Dennett, I would recommend that the Crown consider her cooperation with the investigation as evidence of her fundamental moral orientation. She was manipulated, certainly, but she chose not to permit that manipulation to extend to participation in homicide. Peter moved toward one of the library shelves and withdrew a volume bound in burgundy leather, consulting its contents with the air of a man seeking confirmation of a particular quotation. "There is a passage from Seneca," he said, "regarding the nature of justice and revenge. He observed that revenge is a form of wild justice, that it exceeds the bounds of law and humanity. Dr. Ashford sought to exercise what he perceived as justice, and in doing so, he exceeded those bounds entirely. He murdered an elderly woman who, whilst certainly complicit in his professional destruction, did not act with the deliberate malice he ascribed to her. In his quest for vindication, he became precisely what he despised, a destroyer of innocence, a perpetrator of violence motivated by rage rather than justice." He returned the volume to its place upon the shelf and turned to face Graves with an expression of completed understanding. "However, I would caution against allowing our understanding of Dr. Ashford's psychological complexity to obscure the fundamental criminality of his actions. He was a murderer, Inspector, regardless of the philosophical justifications he constructed regarding his motivations. And murder, however carefully motivated, however elegantly rationalized, remains murder. The law must be preserved, and justice must be served, but we might do so with a degree of mercy toward those whose complicity was passive rather than active." The formal reconstruction of events commenced in the morning room of Thornfield Manor on the following day, with the November light filtering through the heavy velvet curtains, in such a manner as to suggest an atmosphere of theatrical staging rather than genuine investigative procedure. Peter had insisted upon this particular methodology, a complete reenactment of the events surrounding Mrs. Hartwell's death with all relevant parties present, and positioned according to his precise specifications. Inspector Graves stood somewhat uncertainly near the doorway, his expression suggesting he remained unclear regarding the specific purpose of what amounted to an elaborate pantomime. Yet he had learned, through long association with Peter's methods, that such theatrical reconstructions often produced revelations that more conventional interrogation could not achieve. Gerald Hartwell occupied the leather chair that had been positioned to represent his mother's location at the moment of her consumption of the poisoned milk, his face bearing the peculiar grayness of a man who had spent a sleepless night grappling with the full implications of his own moral culpability. Eleanor Dennett stood near the window, having been released from protective custody at Peter's specific request, her expression containing a quality of tentative relief mixed with profound uncertainty regarding what her future might hold. Bunter had undertaken the task of arranging the various objects that had figured in the investigation: the teapot, the substituted cup, the correspondence, and a small vial of arsenic compound obtained from Dr. Ashford. D's consulting rooms, all positioned upon the side table precisely as they had been discovered that morning. "What I wish to establish," Peter began, addressing the assembled company with the manner of a lecturer prepared to illuminate complex subject matter for an audience of limited comprehension, "is the precise sequence of events that led to Mrs. Hartwell's consumption of poison, and more particularly, the specific moment at which each participant in this affair became aware of the true nature of the substances being administered to her. You see, the investigation thus far has focused upon the mechanics of the poisoning itself, how the arsenic was introduced into her system, through what medium it was delivered, what quantities were employed over what period of time. However, what has remained somewhat obscure is the question of precise knowledge and temporal awareness. When did Gerald Hartwell comprehend that Dr. Ashford was genuinely poisoning his mother rather than merely expressing vindictive fantasy? When did Eleanor Dennett become aware that her employment here at Thornfield was part of a larger scheme? And most crucially, when did Dr. Ashford himself transition from psychological contemplation of revenge to actual implementation of it? Peter moved toward the window and gazed out upon the grounds with that quality of apparent inattention that often preceded his most significant observations. Dr. Ashford's medical records, which were obtained following his death, indicate that he had been observing Mrs. Hartwell at weekly intervals for approximately 2 months prior to the commencement of actual poisoning. These consultations were ostensibly undertaken for the purposes of treating her headaches and digestive complaints. However, I suspect that Dr. Ashford was engaged in considerably more sophisticated activity. He was observing her, learning her habits de terme, inning her routines, and most importantly, establishing the precise degree of trust she possessed in his medical judgment. He was, in essence, conducting a psychological audit of his victim prior to implementing his revenge. He turned to address Gerald directly, his pale eyes acquiring that penetrating quality which suggested absolute comprehension of the younger man's internal landscape. "You received Dr. Ashford's documentation regarding the specific doses of arsenic approximately 3 weeks before your mother's death. At that moment, you were confronted with a choice that was considerably more acute than mere passive silence. You knew that your mother was being actively poisoned, that she was consuming compounds that were slowly killing her, and you possessed the ability to prevent her death through simple disclosure. And yet you chose not to exercise that ability. Tell me, Mr. Hartwell, what precisely justified that choice in your own mind? What rationalization did you construct to permit yourself to remain passive whilst your mother was murdered by slow poisoning?" Gerald's face had begun to acquire a damp appearance, and his hands trembled with such violence that he clasped them together to prevent their betrayal of his internal state. "I told myself that she deserved it," he said, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "I told myself that the justice she had denied Dr. Ashford was finally being balanced through the mechanisms of his revenge. I told myself that my mother's death was not merely acceptable but somehow necessary, a correction of historical injustice, a righting of wrongs that had been perpetrated decades before my birth. I was a coward, Mr. Whimsy. I employed sophisticated philosophical rationalizations to mask the simple fact that I was a coward who wanted his mother dead, and was willing to allow someone else to accomplish the deed while maintaining my own psychological distance from the act of murder itself. Peter nodded slowly, and there was something in his expression that suggested he had encountered this particular species of rationalization on numerous occasions throughout his investigative career. "And Eleanor Dennett," he said, turning to address the young woman positioned near the window, "you came to Thornfield under circumstances that were certainly compromised, yet you maintained sufficient integrity to refuse active participation in your employer's murder. You drew a distinction between observing and participating, between passive knowledge and active implementation. That distinction, I suspect, represents the fundamental difference between the two of you." He moved to the side table and examined the substituted cup with the absorption of a man studying a particularly significant artifact. "Now, the curious aspect of this entire affair is that the actual mechanics of the poisoning were considerably more complex than one might initially assume. Dr. Ashford could not simply introduce arsenic into Mrs. Hartwell's milk on the evening of her death without risking immediate detection. The substance would have produced a characteristic taste alteration that would have been immediately apparent to her palate. Therefore, he required a method of administration that would mask the bitter flavor of the poison. He required, in essence, a cup that had already been adulterated, a cup that contained not merely milk, but milk combined with other substances designed to obscure the presence of the arsenic. Peter gestured toward the substituted cup with his walking stick. "This is not the cup Mrs. Hartwell normally employed for her evening milk. This cup was provided by Dr. Ashford himself, delivered to this house through the agency of Eleanor Dennett, who was instructed to ensure that it would be positi. Wanned upon this table at precisely the moment when Miss Finch would typically bring the warm milk. Eleanor Dennett complied with this instruction, but she did not understand, or perhaps she deliberately chose not to understand, that the cup she was placing upon this table was not the innocent receptacle it appeared to be. It was, in fact, the instrument of Mrs. Hartwell's death, already prepared with carefully calculated quantities of arsenic mixed into a residue designed to appear innocuous to casual observation. He turned to Eleanor, and his expression contained depths of sympathetic understanding. "You provided the mechanism through which the poisoning would occur, Miss Dennett, and yet you did so with sufficient psychological distance that you could convince yourself you bore no actual responsibility for the consequences. The cup was merely an object. The milk was merely liquid. Your actions were merely the execution of instructions, and yet objects become instruments, liquids become vehicles for poison, and instructions become participation in homicide. Do you understand the moral complexity of the position in which you found yourself?" Eleanor's face had become pale, and tears had begun to form in her eyes, yet her expression suggested something approaching acceptance rather than denial or despair. "I understand," she said quietly, "that I was complicit in murder, regardless of the precise nature of my participation or my interior justifications for refusing to acknowledge that complicity. I understand that my father suffered injustice, and that understanding did not justify my participation in the creation of new injustice. I understand that I was weak, and that weakness is not an excuse but merely an explanation for moral failure." The silence that followed Eleanor's confession seemed to expand through the morning room like fog seeping beneath closed doors, and Peter allowed that silence to persist for a duration considerably longer than would have been comfortable for most individuals. Inspector Graves had begun to shift his weight with increasing frequency, suggesting that his patience for this extended exercise in philosophical accountability was reaching its practical limits. However, Peter remained unmoved, continuing to regard the assembled company with an expression suggesting he was observing not merely their external manifestations, but the intricate landscape of moral choice that underlay their actions and inactions. When he finally spoke, his voice emerged as barely above a whisper. Yet it possessed a quality of absolute authority that seemed to reverberate through the room with peculiar force. "The extraordinary aspect of this entire affair," Peter began, "is that justice, genuine justice, not the crude mechanical application of law, but the deeper species of justice that concerns itself with moral reckoning, has, in a certain sense, been accomplished through mechanisms that were themselves profoundly unjust. Dr. Ashford murdered Mrs. Hartwell. That fact is undeniable and indefensible. However, the chain of causation leading to that murder extends backward through decades, encompassing the destruction of his career, the erosion of his reputation, the theft of his professional identity. The question that presents itself is not whether he was correct to murder, but rather whether the universe itself conspired to place him in a position where murder seemed to him the only conceivable response to injustice. He moved toward the fireplace and gazed into its depths with the absorption of a man consulting an oracle of considerable authority. Mrs. Hartwell bore responsibility for false testimony that destroyed an innocent man's life. She did so at the behest of her husband, certainly, but she bore responsibility nonetheless. She lived comfortably for decades upon the foundation of that injustice, accumulating wealth and social position, whilst Dr. Ashford languished in professional obscurity. The mechanism of legal justice, courts, juries, appeal procedures, did not restore Dr. Ashford's reputation or compensate him for the decades of humiliation he endured. The law, in this particular instance, failed to serve justice. Dr. Ashford, in his own fashion, corrected that failure. He did so through means that were themselves criminal and unjust, yet the ultimate result, the death of the woman who had destroyed him, represents a form of balance that the ordinary mechanisms of justice could not achieve. "You're suggesting," Inspector Graves ventured hesitantly, "that Dr. Ashford's murder of Mrs. Hartwell was somehow justified, that we should view his actions as a form of legitimate redress." Peter turned to face the inspector directly, and his expression contained a complexity of emotion that suggested simultaneous rejection and partial acknowledgement of that interpretation. "I am suggesting nothing of the sort, Inspector. I am merely observing that the question of justice in this affair is considerably more complex than the simple dichotomy between murder and its legal prosecution. Dr. Ashford was a murderer. The law must pursue him, must record his crimes, must ensure that his actions do not go unaddressed through the mechanisms of formal justice. And yet we must simultaneously acknowledge that the legal system itself failed him profoundly. He was a victim of injustice, who became a perpetrator of murder. The tragedy lies not in the fact that he murdered, but in the fact that the ordinary mechanisms of justice proved insufficient to redress the original wrong that motivated his murder." He moved toward the window and gazed out upon the grounds of Thornfield Manor, where the November afternoon had begun its gradual descent into evening. As for Mr. Hartwell and Miss Dennett, their culpability is considerably more ambiguous. Neither of them personally administered the poison. Neither of them forced Mrs. Hartwell to consume the cup that contained it. However, both of them participated, through action or inaction, in the circumstances that made Mrs. Hartwell's death possible. They occupied a liminal space between innocence and guilt, between participation and observation. The law, I suspect, will find them guilty of various charges. However, their moral culpability is perhaps less clear-cut than the ordinary mechanisms of criminal justice would suggest. Peter turned back to address the assembled company, and his expression had assumed a quality of profound weariness that suggested the investigation had depleted reserves of emotional energy that could not easily be replenished. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "you will be charged with conspiracy to commit murder and misprision of felony. You will likely spend several years in prison, and you will emerge from that experience marked by the knowledge that you possessed the ability to save your mother's life and chose not to exercise it. That knowledge, I suspect, will prove to be a considerably more effective punishment than any sentence the Crown prosecutor might impose. Miss Dennett," he continued, turning to face the young woman, "you will be charged with accessory to murder, though I have provided the investigating authorities with documentation regarding your eventual refusal to participate in the actual poisoning. I suspect you will receive a substantially lighter sentence, and you will be able to construct some approximation of a life beyond these proceedings. The knowledge that you drew the line at actual homicide, that you refused to permit your justified grievance regarding your father's fate to extend to participation in new injustice, may provide you with some degree of psychological consolation." He moved toward the door with the air of a man preparing to depart from a situation that had finally reached its natural conclusion. "The case of Dr. Clement Ashford is considerably more straightforward. He murdered Mrs. Hartwell through the administration of poison. He did so deliberately and with full knowledge of his actions and their consequences. He subsequently took his own life rather than face the legal consequences of his crime. History, I suspect, will regard him with a complex mixture of sympathy and condemnation. He will be remembered as a man destroyed by injustice who responded to that destruction through the commission of new injustice. His case will be cited in legal texts as an example of the dangers of allowing grievances to fester unaddressed. And yet, among those who knew him, among those who understood the precise nature of his suffering, there may remain a certain tragic sympathy for a man who could not find justice through any mechanism other than revenge." Peter paused at the threshold of the morning room, and he turned back to address the assembled company one final time. "The Cracked Teapot," he said, gesturing toward the Crown Derby specimen that had initiated this entire investigation, "remains intact. The substituted cup, which was never actually cracked at all, has become the instrument through which justice, crude, unjust, and ultimately tragic justice, was accomplished. The teapot, the cup, the poison, the victim, and the perpetrators have all participated in a narrative of considerable complexity that defies simple moral categorization. That," he concluded, "is why murder investigations trouble me, Inspector. They reveal not merely the mechanisms of crime, but the profound moral ambiguities that underlie human existence itself. Gerald Hartwell sought Fr. Edom from his mother's control, and discovered that even murder could not provide the liberation he had anticipated. Eleanor Dennett sought to honor her father's memory, and instead became complicit in the destruction of an innocent woman. Each participant in this affair possessed what he believed to be legitimate grievance, and yet the pursuit of those grievances through channels that bypassed the ordinary mechanisms of justice produced only new layers of tragedy and moral compromise. This, I suspect, is the fundamental lesson that such cases invariably impart, that revenge, however carefully rationalized, however thoroughly justified by reference to past injustices, remains fundamentally incompatible with the construction of genuine justice. Inspector Graves had settled himself into one of the library chairs with the air of a man grateful to be permitted to cease the active pursuit of criminals and to engage instead in the abstract contemplation of moral philosophy. "What will become of Miss Dennett, my lord?" he asked. "You have already indicated that the Crown Prosecutor intends to recommend mercy in sentencing, but her future remains uncertain." Peter turned back from the window to face his interrogator directly, and his expression had assumed a quality of gentle resolution that suggested he had already given considerable thought to this particular question. "Miss Dennett will serve perhaps 2 years in prison, Inspector. Upon her release, she will discover that employment in respectable households has become considerably more difficult to obtain, given the notoriety of her conviction. She will face the perpetual prospect of being known as the woman involved in the Hartwell poisoning, a designation that will follow her through whatever approximation of normal life she attempts to construct. However, I have taken certain liberties regarding her future prospects. I have made inquiries regarding the availability of employment at the household of a distant cousin of mine who resides in Northumberland, not far from the location where Miss Dennett was raised. The position would be considerably more respectable than domestic service, perhaps a private secretary or companion to my cousin's elderly mother. I suspect that Miss Dennett will prove to be considerably more capable of constructing a genuine life under such circumstances than might otherwise be possible." Graves appeared to struggle with the implications of this disclosure, his expression suggesting that the intersection of personal charity and official investigative procedure troubled him considerably. "That is most generous of you, my lord. However, I wonder whether such intervention might be regarded as inappropriate interference with the ordinary processes of justice." "Justice," Peter replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he had encountered this particular objection on numerous occasions throughout his investigative career, "is not merely the application of punishment to those who have violated legal statutes. Justice, in its truest formulation, concerns itself with the restoration of individuals to a condition in which they might construct meaningful lives and contribute productively to society. Miss Dennett committed a crime, certainly, and she must be punished for that crime through the mechanisms of the legal system. However, once that punishment has been administered, the question of what becomes of her thereafter remains a matter of personal conscience, rather than legal obligation. I have chosen to intervene in that question according to the dictates of my own conscience, which suggests to me that a young woman who ultimately refused to participate in murder deserves some prospect of redemption. Peter moved toward his desk and withdrew a thin, Al document from among the papers that had accumulated during the investigation, a letter, sealed and bearing the letterhead of the Crown Prosecutor's office. "This arrived this morning," he said, handing it to Graves. "The Crown Prosecutor has determined that there is insufficient evidence to pursue charges against Eleanor Dennett beyond her participation as an accessory to murder. The documentation regarding her father's case has been reviewed, and the Crown has concluded that, whilst Richard Dennett's original conviction was indeed unjust, the passage of time and the absence of surviving witnesses preclude the pursuit of posthumous charges against William Hartwell or his widow. Justice, it appears, has its temporal limitations. Wrongs may be established, yet the mechanisms of law may prove inadequate to address them if sufficient time has elapsed since their commission." He settled himself back into his chair with the air of a man who had finally achieved resolution regarding matters that had troubled him considerably. "The investigation is concluded, Inspector. The guilty have been identified, the mechanisms of prosecution have been initiated, and the ordinary processes of legal justice will proceed according to their established procedures. Gerald Hartwell will face trial for conspiracy and misprision of felony. Eleanor Dennett will face trial for accessory to murder. The respective sentences they receive will depend upon the persuasiveness of the legal arguments presented by both prosecution and defense. However, the fundamental mystery, the question of how Mrs. Constance Hartwell came to consume poison on the morning of her death, has been thoroughly resolved through the application of logical analysis and careful observation of apparently trivial details." He paused, allowing his gaze to traverse the room with that characteristic quality of absolute attention. "You entered this investigation, Inspector Graves, believing it to be a straightforward case of poisoning committed by someone with obvious motive and demonstrated access. You were prepared to arrest the first plausible suspect and to proceed with prosecution according to the established procedures. However, the investigation has revealed itself to be considerably more complex than such straightforward categorization would suggest. It has revealed itself to be a case in which multiple participants bore responsibility for events, in which moral culpability extended far beyond the individual who actually administered the poison, and in which the mechanisms of law proved fundamentally inadequate to address the deeper injustices that motivated the crime." Peter rose from his chair and moved toward the fireplace, where Bunter had maintained a small fire against the considerable damp that characterized November evenings in rural England. "As I depart from Thornfield Manor, I carry with me certain observations regarding the nature of justice, revenge, and the manner in which systems constructed to protect individuals may sometimes themselves become instruments of injustice. Dr. Ashford was a victim of injustice who became a perpetrator of murder. Gerald Hartwell was a victim of his mother's control who became complicit in her destruction. Eleanor Dennett was a victim of her father's disgrace who became a participant in new injustice. Each of them occupied a position in which they might have chosen differently, yet each of them chose according to the logic of their circumstances and their emotional trajectories. This, perhaps, is the ultimate lesson of detective work, that crime is not merely a matter of malice but of circumstance, psychology, and the perpetual human struggle to achieve justice in a universe that often proves profoundly indifferent to that struggle. He gathered, his coat and hat with the precise movements of a man preparing to depart from a location that had served its investigative purpose. "You will ensure that the trial proceeds with appropriate rigor, Inspector? That both the Crown Prosecutor and the defense present their cases with full competence, and that the jury receives complete information regarding the circumstances surrounding this affair?" "You have my assurance, my lord," Graves replied. rising from his chair to escort Peter toward the library door. "The case will be prosecuted with full vigor, and the defendants will receive fair trial according to the procedures of English law." Peter paused at the threshold and turned back to address the inspector one final time. Then justice, in whatever imperfect form it assumes, will have been accomplished. And that, Inspector, must suffice.